One of the things that I have repeatedly tried to do in my own thought is hold forth a transparent consciousness, or a consciousness that has the capacity to see through the constructs that try to placate it, pacify it, or integrate it. This is hard to explain. I've tried to cultivate a mindset that is distasteful and requires strength in order to comprehend it, because it slices through the constructed lie of reality. These are where my thoughts lead me when I seek to take that course. Why is the objection, the objectification of value, obtained best through the negation of death? Why is the objectification of value obtained best through the negation of death? What does this mean, through the negation of death? Not referring to death being negated, but referring to value being negated by death. Referring to human action being contextualized by death. Why is the objectification of value obtained best through the negation of death? Until an activity or object has passed through this, can it be known? Can it really be understood? Don't be ashamed or afraid of using death as a contrast. Use it to drive home the point of value, to contextualize value. Evaluations that ignore this criteria are ignoring the most important reality, the most important criteria, the most final, the most absolute criteria. One must learn how to wield the contrast and criteria of death. Evaluations that ignore this are ignoring one of the strongest existential reality of existence, the reality of death, that everything is subjected to death, everything is subjected to time, everything is subjected to decay. And from this vantage point, when we begin to evaluate our actions, when we begin to evaluate our work, what is indeed its value? Now, there's a morbid way to do this, or I should say a nihilistic, idealistic way to do this, where one uses a criterion of death or absolute meaning to condemn all acts of finite meaning. That is a fallacy. That's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is utilizing the fact of death to help us better contextualize the value of our own activity, the value of our own work, the value of our own interactions. Now, the value that these interactions can have can only ever be a finite evaluation. So that idealistic objection, that nihilistic repudiation, that nihilistic repudiation of meaning or value on the basis of the fact that something is finite, is a fallacy. That kind of objection is an objection that is irrelevant. It is an objection that does not comprehend the existence of value itself. It is using a loaded standard to try to condemn value. But nonetheless, there is still an important criterion here that we should make use of, that we need to learn how to make use of, I believe. I don't think that we can be rigorous enough. I don't think that we can be vigorous enough in trying to use this criteria of death, because death is something that's coming to all of us. Every single person is in the process of dying as soon as they begin living. And so we have to deal with the question of the relevance of life when it is placed within the context of death. And I think we forget this. We get swept up in the cultural world too much, to the point where we lose sight of a higher narrative, a higher metaphysic, we might even say, that has the ability to help us contextualize value to a higher degree. Where does this value leave us? Where does this value take us? Well, it takes us to works that are done in the context of society for the good of society. It does not take us away from the social. It presses us deeper into the social. And why does it press us deeper into the social? Because all meaning is a component, is an attribute of the social. All meaning. All value is contextualized through society. But this is a double-edged sword, because even though all value and meaning is contextualized through society, it doesn't mean, it also means that value and meaning can turn back in a negative way to where society can step away from what we might call a higher existential value, a higher naturalistic value. While we say that all value is derived through the social, it doesn't mean that they're not naturalistic necessities. There are not naturalistic values that lie at the foundation and base of these social values. Humans have a need to eat, they have a need to socialize, and needs of necessity essentially reside at the very base of all other value formations. There's no way past this, because these necessities could never be usurped by the subjective creation of social values. These needs would still take precedent over the subjective formation of social value. So there's a hierarchical structure here. But nonetheless, this criterion of death that can be contrasted with the actions of life is a criterion that matters greatly. Because if we don't use this, if we don't apply this, then one of the problems that we find that we have is that we do fall prey to the tyranny of the subjective constructions of society. If we don't use this, we find that we end up leaving off the higher activities of value. We find that our pursuits can be sabotaged by the vanity of the social, by the confusion of the social, by the confusion of our own psychology in this process. So the question then becomes, what is this value that we are seeking to derive or contextualize with the contrast of the reality of death? I believe the answer to that is the value of the social itself. I believe the highest consciousness that humans obtain to is a consciousness where their activity is informed by this existential consciousness of death, this existential awareness of finality, and that this existential awareness leads us to a broader contextualization of our own activity so that we can begin to understand that activity within the context of a broader social context. When we do this, then we realize that the work that we are performing, we don't think of it in terms of how it amuses us. We don't even think of it in terms of how it entertains or pleases our fellow citizens so much. We think of it in terms as its importance in terms of the longevity of a higher social order. We think of our work in terms of what value it has to the species moving forward into its development into higher ideals. And if we wanted to be more specific, we would say higher ideals of freedom. Because that is essentially the highest ideal that thought ends up obtaining or achieving as it analyzes its place within the universe and as it analyzes its own context of experience, what it is trying to get out of or obtain through its existential experience of life. And so this criterion that we seek to apply as a tactic or technique to help us, to guide us beyond the confusion of our own psychology, the self-deception of our own psychology, the confusion of society, the self-deception of society. As we use this criteria as a guide, we can begin to contextualize our work and the activity of our lives in the context of a higher value that transcends our own limited self-circle of being. This matters. This matters, and I want to talk about the sense in which it matters as I have perceived it, as I've thought of this over the years in my mind. I think it matters greatly when it comes to the kind of social work that we are doing, and this would include art. Very much so, it includes the reality of art. We have to ask the question, what is the value of this form, of this thing, in a broader context? We can't see it oftentimes within its own context. Life actually has to proceed past the point of value in order to retroactively comprehend the value that it just experienced or partook of. We have to look back to it once the era of the event is past, the era of the order is past, the era of the process is past, the era of the creation or the creator is past. We often look back and we can gauge its value to a much higher degree than we ever could at the time of the event's existence, at the time of the creator's existence, at the time of the process. We can look back and gauge this and comprehend a higher value. We can look back and finally contextualize the value that has passed. So the point is to utilize this consciousness in advance, to be able to discern value before the point of value has passed, to be able to discern value not in retrospect, but in a contemporary context, in a context of immediacy, in a context of contemporary activity and contemporary fulfillment. And so the one thing I always think about when I think about this notion, this almost like a hypothetical thought experiment, hypothetical existential thought experiment that is utilized to contextualize the activities and work of life, the relationships of life, I think of it, is increasing as proliferating an individual's courage. That it is to be utilized to expand one's individual courage to proceed deeper into the form that they are engaged in, because this anticipatory mindset comprehends that there is indeed a higher social value, even if those who are within the social context cannot see it, because they have a retrospect consciousness. Their consciousness is the type of consciousness that has to go past the point of value. Only then can they look back and realize that value existed in their midst. The point is to be aware of this in advance, to cultivate this in advance. And this notion or idea of death has the capacity to shatter the lie of the constructed form, to shatter the lie of the false emphasis of value where value is not actually warranted. There is something to this existential procedure, this existential thought experiment. It has the capacity not only to contextualize and guide our own acts of existing, but it has the capacity to infuse us with courage. And that is one of the most important things about this thought experiment. It's why I'm driven to it time and time again. It's why I'm always trying to get to this mindset that is able to understand existence at the edge. A mindset that can contextualize it from the vantage point of absolute finality, so that it can know within itself that it has a certainty that the actions that it is taking or has taken, that it is engaged in, the process that it is engaged in, is a process that has a higher social value. There is such a thing. It really does exist. Many humans have been participants in the building of these social pyramids of higher value. They have been participants in this long historical line of value building, of progress. And so this is a real thing. And so the point is to use this thought of death, this concept of death, this reality of death, to help to contextualize our own activity, to guide it with intelligence, and to infuse us with a greater sense of courage. Courage that we have great need of, because society, only having a retrospect consciousness, is not likely to discern value within its time. The value is very likely going to be a retrospect at the highest level. Later on, it will be contextualized, because it cannot be contextualized in the first place if one does not have an accurate existential context. So this very much matters. So we have need of this courage. This courage, I think above all, not merely to inspire ourselves, to motivate ourselves, but to give us the power, the ability to be able to push back against those retrospect conscious humans who do not have the capacity to discern a higher future social value, and so they are always condemning this value on the basis of a form of immediacy, a pop culture fad. They're condemning it on the basis of their culturation into society. They're condemning it on the basis of constructs that are lacking this existential consciousness. So their condemnation of value is not itself proceeding from a higher context. That's why their evaluation, their denial of value, their dismissal of value, their resistance to it is false, because it does not proceed from a higher social consciousness that can discern value almost from a place of future retrospect. This is the courage that we try to take in, because we try to cultivate this mindset of the future before the future has even arrived. No one can do this infallibly. This is always just an exercise in probability. But nonetheless, the point is to engage in this act or process of intelligence so that we can infuse our own activities with higher intelligence, and so that we can find the courage to lean boldly into those activities, into that work, because we perceive that we are in fact laboring toward the formation, toward the architecture, the building of a higher and larger social pyramid of value.